Welcome to Elite Beyond Borders with Odai. In this episode, we will spotlight the dialogue that took place between Canadian psychologist and thinker Jordan Peterson and British-Egyptian preacher Mohammed Hijab. A debate, or rather a conversation, followed by another discussion inside a mosque accompanied by French sculptor Jonathan Peugeot. Peterson explained that the purpose of these dialogues was to reach common ground, a shared foundation for communication between the West and Islam, or what is often called the Islamic world. The purpose of this episode is not to explore the details of those discussions, but rather to examine the assumption that there exist intellectual structures connecting what are known as Islamic societies, to such an extent that finding common ground with these structures would mean discovering common ground with all Muslim-majority societies. This assumption is paired with another, that corresponding structures exist in Western societies, bearing the same unifying qualities. This also brings into question the criteria for identifying which group truly represents these structures, the one supposedly carrying cultural traits shared by a vast range of societies. The traditional civilizational classification of contemporary societies, Islamic, Western Christian, Hindu, Confucian, Orthodox, and others, is the product of continued transmission of the intellectual structures that represent these civilizational divisions from one generation to another. This transmission began before the Common Era for the religions of Central and East Asia and continued into the 6th and 7th centuries CE with the rise and spread of Islam, which helped shape the solid contours of the Abrahamic era, contours that remain present to this day. With the expansion and growing number of sources shaping individual awareness beyond the local community during the past 100 years. A process intensified by the communications revolution that made the flow and speed of data across all levels and fields the defining feature of our age. The formation of intellectual structures representing traditional civilizational divisions coincided with the emergence of new intellectual frameworks within these same societies. These new frameworks contained evaluations, principles, and scientific facts that undermined the foundations of the traditional civilizational order. As a result, new intellectual currents and social strata have arisen that define themselves outside the framework of the local society. The formation of these groups is structurally tied to the political and economic circumstances of each country. It should be noted that once intellectual frameworks from outside the local context become accessible, through education, the media, or even within the social space itself, the evaluations of the traditional structures representing civilizational divisions automatically lose their totality. Moreover, the more abundant the external sources of awareness available from an early age, the weaker and more limited the presence of those traditional structures becomes. Since the early 20th century, almost everywhere, each generation has passed on the intellectual structures representing civilizational divisions to the next in a less complete and more diminished form. The communications revolution accelerated this process, particularly among the millennial generation, born 1984 and after. This development suggests that the 21st century may witness the end of the Abrahamic era and the beginning of the data age. The data age already has deep foundations in economics, politics, and education, and plays a central role in the movement of societies. Dataism refers to the idea that the collection and analysis of data, whether by humans or artificial intelligence algorithms, for the purpose of decision-making or determining value, becomes the new reference point instead of texts, whether religious or belonging to any other intellectual system. Thus, the 20th and 21st centuries represent a transitional phase, defined by the coexistence and entanglement of intellectual systems that differ radically in moral evaluation, behavioral codes, and interpretive visions of the world, both within the cultural fabric of societies and within individual consciousness itself. Consequently, the so-called Islamic character of Islamic societies is diminishing and non-total. Its presence varies from one society to another and from one individual to another, depending on the political and economic conditions governing each nation. In addition, these societies, like others, contain vertical intellectual divisions, conservative trends grounded in religion or nationalism, and others based on non-religious frameworks such as liberalism, communism, and feminism. Hence, there are no intellectual structures uniting all individuals within a single society, and therefore, no unifying intellectual structure binding what are called Islamic societies, which are marked instead by layers of ideological and intellectual divisions that transcend traditional geo-civilizational boundaries. What has been explained so far leads to the first flaw in Jordan Peterson's call for a dialogue between Islam and the West. There are no unifying intellectual structures embodied in the Islamic identity of those societies. The same applies to the West, which also lacks unified theoretical foundations representing it as a whole. The second flaw lies in the fact that societies act and shape their stances primarily on the basis of political and economic realities, not on theoretical or textual doctrines. For instance, the Sunni-Shia conflict that flared up in the Middle East after Hezbollah's intervention in Syria on behalf of the Syrian regime, though its roots go back to the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, was accompanied by the massive proliferation of narratives and literature fueling sectarian differences between Sunnis and Shiites across the media and social sphere, gaining strong presence in collective consciousness. Yet these narratives, though centuries old, were previously marginalized. Even when they appeared, they never achieved such resonance, largely due to the wide popular sympathy for Hezbollah during its military confrontations with Israel in 2006. Another example is the non-adherence to jurisprudential restrictions concerning migration to non-Muslim countries, a result of the collapse of several Arab states in the Middle East and their dire economic realities. In such cases, political and economic facts activate and give real force to the rulings and evaluations contained in cultural and religious texts, pushing them into the public sphere, or, depending on context, deactivate or undermine them, diminishing their relevance or transforming their function within society. The third flaw lies in the choice of Muhammad Hijab, a specialist in Islamic jurisprudence, as a representative of Islamic societies. Specialization in Islamic jurisprudence, whose scholars often belong to Salafi or fundamentalist currents, is not a natural result of growing up in an Islamic environment. It requires deliberate personal effort, like any academic field. It also demands the exclusion of evaluations originating outside the jurisprudential heritage, and sometimes even outside the Salafi interpretation of that heritage. For this reason, it is difficult for the Salafi mode of thinking to represent an entire social mass, because there is no practical way to impose a process that would compel a large, diverse population to undertake such intellectual labor. Consequently, any common ground achieved with that group remains confined to its narrow intellectual circle. In conclusion, Jordan Peterson's invitation to a dialogue between Islam and the West rests upon stereotyping and reductionism, a simplification of the complex realities of what are called Islamic and Western societies, and of how their social dynamics actually function. It also overlooks the rapid cultural transformations now sweeping across the world, as well as the interlocking complexities that could, at any moment, generate new conflicts and global instability. In the next episode, we'll move from deconstruction to precise foresight, tracing how global power dynamics may evolve through the intertwined, yet alien intellectual structures we've already uncovered in this video.